Good morning and good day, everyone in the United States, Canada, around the world, wherever else you may be, and certainly friends in the Democratic Republic of Congo. My name is Mike O'Hanlon. I'm a senior fellow at Brookings and the co-director with Fonda Brown of the Africa Security Initiative, also a former Peace Corps volunteer to the former Zaire in 1982 to 1984 in the great city of Kikwit. So I hope some friends there may be watching, but I am just thrilled today to be able to convene and honor and publicize the work of outstanding scholars, practitioners, activists who have thought long and hard about Congo. And we're going to begin with a discussion of Jason Stearns' new book, The War That Doesn't Say Its Name. Jason has an uncanny ability both for choosing outstanding titles as well as for the amazing field research he's done now for a couple of decades or longer in DRC. Also having created the Congo Research Group at New York University, where he's still active, and he's an assistant professor at Simon Fraser University out in the great Wild West of British Columbia in Canada, where he resides. So he will begin today with a little bit of an opening, talking about two or three of the major themes of his book, which certainly, as many of you will have gathered from the title or having read it yourselves already, underscores the degree to which the conflict, especially in Eastern Congo, has just proven intractable, really is almost the world's #1 forever war. And there's almost a political economy that perpetuates this. It's made it very hard to solve or stop, despite the presence of a UN peacekeeping mission and a UN peace deal for a couple of decades. So that is the starting point. We will then, with great privilege and pleasure, turn to Francesca Bomboko, who is a Congolese citizen, Columbia University graduate, many wonderful things she's done throughout her career. Today, she leads the Bureau d'études pour les recherches and consulting international, BERCI, as it's shortened and by its acronym in French. And she will speak not only to Jason's book and the thesis that he will have laid out at that point, but also to her broader views about the state of politics and conflict in the DRC today. Then my colleague Danielle Resnick will speak and maybe take a little broader prism on how friends in Congo relate to broader issues and trends in the great continent of Africa. She is a David Rubenstein Fellow at the Brookings Institution. She's part of the Africa Growth Initiative, a related sister effort that we are privileged and pleased again to partner with in our work at Africa Security Initiative. And her most recent book is Urban Poverty and Party Populism in African Democracies, as well as many other publications that she's produced over the years and done field research in close to a dozen African countries. So that's the basic format. After we hear from each of the three, I'll add a couple of questions myself, and then we'll hope to get some of your thoughts and questions at events@brookings.edu. Again, the email address, if you'd like to send those in, would be at events@brookings.edu. And as moderator, I will try to sort of condense some of those questions into ones that I can then pose to the panel in our last 20 minutes or so. So that's the game plan. Again, thank you everyone for joining. Merci mingi, as we say in Kikwit. And Jason, over to you, my friend.
Thanks very much, Mike. Thank you everyone for being here. I will try to be brief since we have a lot scheduled. There are academic reasons that I wrote this book, and some of the book does actually engage with the academic literature on wars, the kind of methodologies we use. But the main reason I wrote this book is due to a moral urgency. The main paradox that I highlight is that after the two first wars in the Congo, the Great Wars of 1996 to 2003, a peace deal was signed involving massive international involvement, the African Union, the United Nations. And due to this peace deal, the country was reunited. All former belligerents merged into a new national army. A new constitution was passed, and the Third Republic was forged, in which we now find ourselves today in the Congo. This Third Republic is characterized by democratic institutions, and in 2006, the first truly democratic elections were held in over 40 years. That was a huge success. And yet, violence in the Congo has persisted. It's even escalated, becoming more amorphous, less sensational, less newsworthy, but no less detrimental. Today, as we speak, there are 5.6 million people displaced in the Eastern Congo. That is more than ever before in Congolese history, around 2 million more than at the height of the Great Congo Wars. That's also more than anywhere else in the world outside of Syria. There are 120 armed groups fighting over a host of different, often extremely parochial issues. And the Congo has largely disappeared from news headlines and the priorities of the United Nations Security Council, the US government, and others. It's a war, as one Congolese friend told me, that does not say its name, hence the title for the book. And so the question that my book seeks to answer is why? Why does this war, why did it persist despite all of this involvement? And what did we get wrong? What did outsiders get wrong? What did Congolese themselves perhaps get wrong? Part of the answer I provide, but I won't dwell on it too much here, you can read the book, is historical. I trace the trajectory of the peace process to try to understand what happened. And broadly speaking, the peace deal that was signed in 2002, despite all of the successes, also carried inside it the seeds of a new war. It was lopsided. One of the most powerful belligerents, the RCD, that controlled a third of the country, was fated to be decimated at the upcoming elections. It knew this, and it launched a sort of plan B, a new rebellion, the CNDP, in 2004, with the backing of the Rwandan government. In response, the new Congolese government under Joseph Kabila, still unsure of itself, unsure of the loyalties of the new national army, responded not by creating an efficient, disciplined army, but rather by bolstering patronage networks within the security forces and supporting proxy militias in the Eastern Congo. This was the beginning of the fragmentation that continues until today. Underlying this was a misunderstanding by many actors, especially foreign donors that invested over $40 billion, sent the largest peacekeeping mission in the world to the Congo, a misunderstanding of what was driving the crisis. In the civil wars literature or in the literature on conflicts, we can often find variables that people seek to use to explain conflicts. Natural resources, poverty, ethnicity, land, all of these play an important role in the Congo, a very important role in the Congo. But for me, the importance is not in understanding variables because they actually don't sufficiently explain the crisis. I can get back to that if you want. But what I focus on is the nature of the Congolese and the Rwandan states. For me, these are the two most critical actors, and I spend most of my book focusing on understanding how they perceive their own interests and how they are structured. For a parenthesis, I think actually that this parallels a lot of the debates that are currently being had on the Ukraine and understanding the interests of the Russian state and the Russian leadership in what's going on in Ukraine. In brief, in the Congo, over 25 years of fighting, many have suffered from the conflict, but a slim class of commanders and politicians has emerged for whom the conflict has become a source of survival and profit. It's what I call the military bourgeoisie. These protagonists have had little interest in bringing an end to a conflict that was peripheral for the government, but for many combatants has become a livelihood. Conflict, in other words, as well as peacemaking, has become an end in itself. The fighting has become carried forward by its own momentum. Meanwhile, foreign donors and diplomats provide food and urgent healthcare for millions, preventing the Congolese state from collapsing, but unable to bring about transformational change. Congolese have developed their own, often very witty ways of expressing the state of affairs. In the Eastern Congo, one could often hear "no nkunda, no job." That's referring to the main rebel commander in 2008. Or more recently, they refer to Ebola business, relating to the humanitarian efforts to bring an end to the Ebola conflict in the Eastern Congo. The great Congolese author Nkoli Jean Bofane explains this culture of anti-valeur or unethical behavior in his novel Mathématiques Congolaises. The protagonist in this novel, who's a mathematical savant, makes use of his skills to uncover the hidden logic of Congolese politics. Having grown up in poverty, he puts his creativity to use for a powerful government minister, only to discover that his boss was staging falsified protests in order to manipulate public opinion and crack down on his opponents. And so in Congolese culture, in Congolese sayings, even in pop music, the fantastic Congolese, very eccentric Congolese pop star Koffi Olomide once said, "Oyo eza systemi alifelo, moto ezopela kasi tozozikate," which means we live in a system of hell. Everywhere the fire is raging, but we don't get burned. Throughout all of these sayings, you can see the Congolese themselves understand that the involution, as I put it, of the Congolese conflict, the degree to which the conflict has folded in on itself and perpetuates itself through its own logic. Part of this is through naked economic interests, as Mike pointed out, the political economy of the conflict. But part of this, and this is important for me, is also highlighting this has become ideational or even cultural. There's been a normalization of violence, in particular through a cultivation of apathy, both in the Congo and abroad, and through the essentialization of identity. That's just the way that people are in the East. That's just the way things are. And I discuss these two issues, these two trends, normalization and essentialization in the book. The second actor that I put a lot of emphasis on is the Rwandan government, where different factors led to a very similar outcome. The Rwandan government itself was perhaps the most important actor in perpetuating the conflicts and making sure the conflict would be reignited after the peace deal in 2003, and became invested in conflict at least until 2013, when its main proxy in the Eastern Congo, the M23, was defeated. Here, it was a very different set of factors that played into it. The RPF's, the ruling party's institutional culture, internal conflicts within the government, and a concentration of power in the presidency or even in one person played an extremely important role. In contrast with a lot of explanations for Rwandan's involvement, I don't think that either ethnic solidarity, in other words, solidarity with Kinyarwanda-speaking people in the Eastern Congo, or natural resources played a role. In fact, the Rwandan government makes much more money today off natural resources in the Eastern Congo than it ever has in its history, even though there are very few Rwandan soldiers, if any, deployed currently in the Eastern Congo. Instead, I focus on other factors, on the nature of the Rwandan government and the RPF ruling party itself. The RPF's main perceived threat comes from its own army. It doesn't face much threat from internal democracy. There's President Paul Kagame runs a fairly tight shop in Kigali, and it knows that if it will be overthrown, it will probably come from within its own ruling class, in particular from within its own army. It's also very afraid of the Ugandan government, where it itself was based when it was still a rebellion. And so therefore, a lot of its focus has been trying to figure out how to manage its own ruling elites and how to manage its own army. Waging a war against quote unquote genocidaire, in other words, the people who carried out the genocide in Rwanda in 1994, waging a war against them in the Congo focused the attention of the Rwandan Defense Forces and highlighted the ongoing threat of genocide. And it's the legitimacy of the RPF is really wrapped up in the genocide and the notion that it is the protector of the Rwandan people, especially the Tutsi, against the renewed genocide, and that it brought an end to the genocide in 1994. So in sum, and I'd be happy to expand on this in question and answer, in sum, I highlight the symbiosis of the Congolese conflict, the degree to which all the actors involved to a certain extent have an interest in perpetuating the conflict. It's a system of conflict. It's not a grand conspiracy of conflict. I believe that many of these actors would prefer not to have a conflict in the Eastern Congo. But by the nature of this system, it keeps on perpetuating itself. Perhaps just to finish, some of the main flaws of international intervention in the Eastern Congo: we misdiagnosed the Rwandan state and the Congolese state to a certain extent. We misdiagnosed in the sense that foreign donors believed, and I document this in my book, that the Rwandan government was actually not engaging in destabilization of the Eastern Congo in much of this period, or did not play a major role, at least in much of this period. And we were in a perverse situation where foreign donors were bankrolling the Rwandan state, often to the tune of around half of its budget, at the same time as we were spending billions of dollars dealing with the humanitarian consequences of Rwandan involvement in the Eastern Congo. We misdiagnosed the Congolese state by believing that it actually was trying, it had an interest in creating an efficient, even if authoritarian state. And that was not correct in the Congo. The Congolese government was not and remains relatively apathetic towards the creation of a stable, secure Eastern Congo. And finally, I think the liberal peace building model believed that by creating both simultaneously a democracy and a free market in the Congo, that peace would come about. In other words, by creating a democratic system, that's the new Third Republic that we live in, as well as in liberalizing the economy, especially the mining sector, and inviting in or boosting foreign direct investment in the Congo, that would stabilize the country, provide a peace dividend and stabilize the country. Instead, what happened was the influx of billions of dollars in foreign direct investment was very quickly captured by this new nascent elite and undermined the fledgling democratic institutions that were being created during the transition and have undermined them until today, because this new elite has captured much of this wealth that came in, especially in the mining sector. So I'm gonna keep it to there. I was asked to talk for around 12 to 15 minutes, and I think that's about it. I very much welcome the thoughts of both Danielle and Francesca, and as well as Mike, as well as those of anybody else on the call. Thank you very much.
It's a fantastic overview, really succinct and eloquent, and yet rich in detail and very accessible. So thank you. Let me ask one small follow-up, and then I will go to Francesca. You talked about Rwanda. You talked about the various 120 ethnic or armed ethnic groups of various stripes and localities in the East. You talked about the role of the government, power brokers. Could you add a word about the UN peacekeeping mission? How have they been part of the problem? Is it just lack of capacity despite the relatively large size, or making the wrong political associations and alliances? How would you describe their role so far?
So, I mean, the UN peacekeeping mission, I was a member of the UN peacekeeping mission way back in the day. They played an extremely important role in bringing an end to the conflict and the peace deal in 2002. They were then, they shepherded through the transition, again, with many successes. The fact that today the Congo is united, has a constitution, has democratic institutions, holds elections. Much of this is thanks to the UN peacekeeping mission. You know, UN peacekeeping doctrine puts an emphasis on what they call the primacy of the political. In other words, everything the UN does should be aimed at shepherding through a political process. That political process existed, and the UN played that role with many flaws, but played that role up until 2006. In 2006, after the first elections, the government said, look, we're sovereign now, we're a sovereign nation. We will not allow for UN meddling in internal political affairs. And the UN transitioned into a post-conflict stabilization mission. And this is the paradox. We are not in a post-conflict period. In many ways, the conflict is very much alive. And there are 120 different armed groups, but there is no political process. Since 2006, there has been virtually no political process to engage, especially with those domestic actors. The UN is not playing the role of a political broker. It's been marginalized from that because the government doesn't want it to play that role. And the UN doesn't feel like it should meddle in internal affairs. And so you'll often see the UN being very reticent at commenting on what it perceives to be the affairs of a sovereign member state. This, I mean, to a certain degree, there's nothing the UN can do about this. This is just the cards that it was dealt. But it refuses, and this is my criticism of the UN mission, it refuses even to acknowledge that. And it refuses, or at least its leaders often refuse to acknowledge the fact that it's been politically marginalized, and it's dealing with a government in particular that often does not act in the best interests of its own citizens.
Thank you very much. Francesca, we're really honored to have you with us today. You've contributed so much to your country throughout your career, and you have such a deep and rich perspective on these questions. So I just would like to hand the floor to you to talk about Jason's book to the extent you wish, but also just to pick up the subjects that he's raised and talk about how things look in Congo to you today, the big problems, maybe the big possibilities, any positive trends you see as well, but just to help frame the subsequent policy discussion for us. And thanks again for joining today.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I would like to say that I thought that Jason's book was very sensitive in a way. There was no preconceived judgment of any of the issue that he talked about, and it showed real understanding of the Congolese dynamic. And three things came across to me while reading the book: mixed diagnosis, missed opportunity, and lack of understanding of Congolese dynamic. Those are the three issues that I think are coming across again and again in a different chapter as we go along. And I will try to relate that what's happening today. one of the things that you talked about, in your introduction is how armed violences is seen as an acceptable and established means of obtaining power and resources. It's still the case today, and I do agree, is basically what described the best the Congolese dynamic. But what I don't particularly agree is the onset of those dynamics. I would say that if you look at, you need to really look at the root causes of it into the 60s. With the first, I don't know, in English you say mutinery, how do you say that?
Mutiny.
What do you call mutinery?
The mutiny.
Hello?
Mutiny.
Yes, the first in the 60s. And if you look at the profile of those soldiers, they were exactly the same profile of the rebels today, meaning people with very little educations, people with really no sense of the state, and people who will gratify which violence seems to mean to get political power at the time. The government, the first government of DRC, gave in to all of the demand without any conditions. And if you look at the profile also of the people within that government, only 2 people had university degrees. So the weaknesses of the Congolese politician in the 60s to actually understand what was going on by giving into the military, after killing, after raping, after looting, had some analysts actually, I put some analysts saying that the real coup d'etat was not in 1965, but was in 1960. In 1965 was just a recognition of the military took over the situations. What we see in what you're describing in the 2003 and the 2008 Congolese war is actually a reverse phenomenon, when people who originally didn't belong to the army became, if you look at the head of RCD Goma, the head of MLC, to some extent, except maybe Joseph Kabila, people realized that the only way actually to gain political power was to actually join the rebellion. And there's something that you described very well also with the example of the Mai Mai team, how, once the negotiation were actually over in the Sun City Peace Agreement, l'accord global et inclusif, they become, people gain some political status. They also gain some political positions, and they were selling their political positions. And this is something that it's not only part of the, I would say, conflict dynamic. It's also something that you see in different level of the society. I will just give you one example. At the Security Council, DRC has been known to sell its seats several times to other African countries, just to be able to actually, there was no political reasons particularly, but just to be able to survive. So it's also a question of survival of the different dynamics. I don't know if I understand myself correctly. Please, Jason, help me out here. But this is something that I thought was very interesting. About the missed opportunity, if we agree that the violence and the war, the armed mobilizations is the mean to seize power in DRC, we had really in 2018 a missed opportunity with the new elections. The elections actually, like you said, 2006 was well perceived. 2011, a little less. The 2018, the latest one, we actually saw something that gave the power back to the army, so to speak, because Joseph Kabila, which is a pure product of the army, had to decide who won the elections. So if the system of rewarding violences could stop one day in DRC, we actually had a missed opportunity to do so in 2008. And once we talked about the lack of understanding of Congolese dynamic, there's something very interesting happening at the moment that relates with the current event and the worldwide issue, particularly with Ukraine, was a lot of people do not understand, particularly the international community, they do not understand the perception that DRC and particularly DRC population have with the conflict. They thought with what we went through with the sovereignty issue regarding the eastern part of Congo, that the population will actually support more so than they have been doing, particularly when you look at social social networks, conversations. The support is not what was expected. And there's a real huge debate here about, sovereignty issues and also about the reactions of the international community, which can explain some of the issues that you point out regarding the Congolese dynamic.
Francesca, can I ask you a question right there? And then before I want to move on to Danielle in a minute and then come back to you on the policy discussion, but I really would like to explore your thinking about President Tshisekedi. You just mentioned the 2018 elections were not impressive. Jason talks about those in his book, but he also acknowledges that President Tshisekedi seems to have partly pushed aside some of the Kabila cronies since he became president, and perhaps that's a hopeful sign. I'd certainly like Jason to speak to that later as well, but from your point of view, is there any positive movement at all in Congolese politics today? If you could comment on that, and then I'd like to go to Danielle and then come back to all three of you on the policy discussion.
No, absolutely, because in a way, President Tshisekedi actually is true. There was a saying in the RC by the old politician that say, it's the driver that changed, but the car is still the same. Mm. So the system, Jason is talking about the system. The system has not changed. We have a new president, it's true, but what apparently, what President Tshisekedi basically and his team are doing is perpetuating the system that was put in place without trying to change anything out of the system, profiting to at the same time of these systems, but not initiating real change. To the exception, maybe issue involving corruptions is something that we see a lot of action being taken. But the question is, are those actions actually taken to change the system? Or is it a way to replace some of the old actor of the system into a new actor that will be more, that will be from your team versus from the other team? So this is basically what's going on.
Thank you. It's very helpful. And sorry to interrupt. I'm just that's very helpful. I just really want to, if I could, go to Danielle and stay on this subject for a minute, and then come back to all of you on the policy discussion, as well as the questions we're getting from the audience. Because Danielle, I know you've studied African democracy more generally across the continent, and just with your cross-national perspective, how does the state of play in DRC look to you today? And any other broad comments you'd want to make to set the tone for the conversation going forward. Thanks to you as well for joining us.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Michael. And thanks to Jason and Francesca. I think the DRC is really a quintessential case in so many respects, especially given that the African continent has really seen a record number of insurgent and civil conflicts over the last 5 years. And it really starts to raise a lot of questions about, as Francesca was alluding to, state legitimacy and sovereignty, and what does it mean to be a nation state within territorial borders when service provision is extremely low, minimal accountability for corruption, and the government lacks a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. So I think, Jason's book's really a masterpiece in many, many respects, especially for those interested in understanding the war and the ongoing conflict. But what I really like is he kind of debunks this academic impulse to uncover the one overriding cause of conflict, and in turn the practitioner's impulse to find the one or two policy interventions needed to address it. So it's clearly this story about conjunctural conditions and this great concept he talks about, the involution of interest that comes about as conflicts are layered upon each other and new sources of patronage, from various sources start to take precedence. And also this generational clash between young and old and a reordering of the relevance of customary authority and ethnic relations if you have waves of immigrants, refugees, and IDPs over time. And so for that reason, I think it's really a cautionary tale about the long-term dynamics that could emerge in many of the other regions' conflicts. I think, as you noted, Michael, there's a lot of relevance to the rest of the region. Let me just touch briefly on six areas I think are key more broadly. One is, as Jason, was talking about towards the close of his remarks, the role of Rwanda. Is it a developmental state or a rogue state? Jason shows the extent of Rwanda's role under Kagame and the DRC, and then the need for Rwanda to have an amenable leader in Kinshasa to continue to ensure Kagali's own regime longevity. And that clearly exacerbated the instability in the country. There's really this ambivalent role the international community has with Rwanda, with on the one hand, seeing within its borders a highly lauded developmental state because of its commitment to national development and anti-corruption. And then on the other hand, many saying that Rwanda's most prominent export is its military. And we haven't just seen this in the DRC, but we've also seen it in Central African Republic and in Mozambique. In the latter, the Mozambican government controversially sidelined the Southern African Development Community and preferred to use the Rwandan military to intervene to deal with insurgents there in the Cabo Delgado region. So I think the role of Rwanda in the DRC really resonates more broadly in the region. Secondly, I think, for me, Jason's book raised a lot of questions about the right approach to peacekeeping and post-conflict settlements. There's this trade-off that he points to, about you either incorporate only the major actors in the hopes of reducing the log rolling and patronage needed to keep a wide camp of actors involved, or alternatively, you have to keep the process broad enough to ensure that excluded groups don't destabilize the political settlement. But this ultimately becomes very unwieldy for actual effective governance, this fragmentation issue that Jason points to. And I think, Sudan has been a really good example of this, where there was an attempt to bring in a very broad tent, the military, the paramilitary, the rebel forces, into a coalition with citizens' resistance committees, trade unions, and various opposition parties with very distinct interests and diverging incentives around the democratic transition, which, as we saw in October, eventually reversed course and went back to kind of a military government. And a third point, relatedly, is the inordinate attention sometimes given to elections as the false endpoint of the post-conflict settlement. Elections really change the rules of the game, and to some extent, Jason argues that they, in some cases, exacerbated parts of the conflict by solidifying military and societal divisions through the mechanism of political parties, which I think you stated is now there's more than 600 political parties in the country, which is mind-blowing. And at the same time, the elections, can both increase the stakes of winning, and if there's a credible threat for dissatisfied parties to defect and resume or foment conflict, elections do not always create that safety valve for contestation and debate that they hope they will, especially if parties are emerging from rebel groups, the militia, rather than civil society. So in this regard, I think there's a lot of cautionary tales when the international community demands electoral timetables, without examining the party landscape and considering who may have an interest in derailing elections or undermining a democratic transition. This is where I think a lot of the recent demands by the international community to hold elections as soon as possible in the Sahelian countries that have been overrun by coups, such as Burkina Faso, Mali, and Guinea, need to be carefully considered, because elections are often the beginning rather than the endpoint of the post-conflict settlement. Fourth is devolution and decentralization. Is that really an answer to mitigate conflict, or does it, again, contribute to the fragmentation that Jason mentions, making it more difficult to rein in some of the various actors who foment conflict? as Jason was talking about with the Constitution in 2006 in the DRC, we've seen this gradual movement toward greater decentralization. I think it's been an ongoing process, culminating, I think, in 2015 with this creation of 26 provinces with a set of non-concurrent powers to the provinces, and using devolution as hopefully a way to mitigate tensions. We've seen this across the continent, and it raises a lot of questions. Does decentralization, devolution, and/or federalism as a form of conflict resolution, is that the right approach? We've seen this raised with regards to the civil war in Ethiopia, where ethnic federalism had previously been viewed as a way to mitigate fights over controlling the center by giving local communities greater autonomy. But of course, we saw the way it exacerbated different divisions in Ethiopia. Similar questions being raised about devolution as a mitigation technique in Cameroon between the Anglophone and Francophone regions. Mozambique changed its constitution recently to devolve a little bit more to appease the main opposition party and resistance group Renamo. And Kenya, of course, is the great example in 2010 constitution, switching to devolution to deal with the kind of post-electoral violence we saw in 2008. So does this approach really kind of diffuse tensions, or does it create a new set of powerful local elites who can make more demands on the center? And I think I'll just end with the role of civil society, particularly religious organizations. I think Jason pointed to the role of the Catholic Church in his book as being a really critical civil society actor. We know that in past elections, like in the 2008 elections, they were one of the few that was able to allocate election observers across the whole country. And I know more recently, they have been raising questions about the appointment of the head of the Electoral Commission. And this really mirrors what we see in broader parts of the continent, where religious organizations, especially if they have a large following and are not seen to be compromised, can be a really important voice for oversight when formal institutions of oversight, like the legislature and political parties, are not working as they should. This was, for instance, quite key in Zambia, particularly in its most recent elections in August, where the churches assisted with a parallel vote tabulation of the results to avoid the incumbent rigging the elections. And we've seen this in other parts of the continent, such as Muslim Marabou leaders playing a very strong role in oversight and accountability in Senegal, for instance. So I'll leave it there with those 5 points. And thanks again for the opportunity to participate.
Danielle, that was fantastic. So what I'd like to do now in our remaining 20-some minutes is to have 2 rounds where each of you will speak, once in those rounds. And first, I want to just sort of turn things open to ask each of you to say what's on your mind at this point in the conversation. Very rich conversation. And but I would hope maybe 1 or 2 policy recommendations would also be part of your next intervention, whether for the international community, the United States, Canada, the European Union, and of course, the UN system, President Tshisekedi, the Rwandan government, anybody you want to emphasize, really maybe just 1 or 2 of your most specific policy recommendations. After we hear from everyone, then I'll go to the questions. We've got about a half dozen we've received. I'll read them all quickly. You can take notes on which 1 or 2 you might want to respond to in our final round. And I think if you don't mind, Jason, I'll start with Francesca at this point, since I sort of interrupted her last time, and she is our Congolese friend who's sitting in Kinshasa. And I would really love to know what's most on your mind, Francesca, about what you think needs to be done next and who you want to address that proposal or plea to, whether it's the international donor community, the President Tshisekedi government, or someone else. And then I'll go to Jason and then Danielle, please.
Hello.
There you go. Yep, coming through loud and clear.
Okay. I think what happened so far was the development issue with the international donors and the conflict and security sector issue were kind of dealt with separately. What we tried to do, Jason is starting his book with the Goma conferences, and I was there at the Goma conferences, and my role was to make sure that every resolution that came part of this community peace processes be integrated into the development program of the government. And this is something very difficult to do because the security sector is a prerogative of the presidency. And so some reforms need to be there to have a security sector accountable and to actually try, when we think about development, we think about poverty, we think about stabilizations, It's not a coincidence. And most of the unstable parts of the country are also the poorest part of the country. There's something to be said about that. Is to really find a way to integrate all those issues together with the most pertinent stakeholders. I mean, what we do, what the government does when they're planning the development program with donors, I mean, the army doesn't know, the security doesn't know, the presidency is not involved. So these fragmentations of Congolese policies, and we don't have a long-term vision also. What type of Congo do we want in the next 30 years? And put everybody together. And I think what needs to be done next, and maybe to sit down and to really look at, talk about the Congolese visions of for the next generations, for what they want to be as a country, then maybe that could be the beginning of all those different components working together, and that could lessen some of the fragmentation that we see.
Fantastic. Jason, over to you, please, for your thoughts about going forward, as well as anything else that's on your mind at this part of the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate the comments everybody's made, and I agree, I think, with almost all of them. I think speaking of missed opportunities, Francesca raised the 2018 elections, and I really agree. I think that throughout there's been a notion that sometimes we need to sacrifice the perfect for the good. And I understand that impulse, but sometimes it's also aligned with the fact that we make compromises on accountability. And I think accountability really is the key thing that has been missing from this whole process. In other words, for example, in the East now, and I think this is the one point that perhaps I'll make, the government imposed a state of siege in order to deal with armed groups. Now, the state of siege, I think, does exactly the opposite of what is required. The real thing that's required in the Eastern Congo is not actually dealing with the 120 different armed groups, but is dealing with the Congolese army itself. The Congolese army is the crucible, really, of this conflict. And if you want to bring about transformational change, it's not about dealing with one or the other of these 120 different armed groups. It's about reforming and rendering more efficient and accountable the Congolese army itself. The state of siege did the opposite. The state of siege actually suspended civil liberties. And so made it more difficult to criticize that Congolese army. There are youth activists in the Eastern Congo in jail at the moment because of their criticism of the Congolese army. The US government as well has been tending in this direction, I think, unfortunately, because it's framing some of the conflict in the Eastern Congo as counterterrorism operations, because there is an Islamist armed group involved in the conflict. And the US government, or parts of the US government, I would say, tends to see this through the lens of the war on terror. And I think that as well, again, is not going to be conducive, because that's deflecting attention from the Congolese government, the Congolese army itself, and focusing on this one actor, which is a very brutal and reprehensible actor. But again, I think the key actor, and if you want to bring about transformational change, it's the Congolese state, and in particular, the Congolese army itself. And so I think that there needs to be much more focus in terms of, if you look at USAID spending, very, very little of that goes to democracy and human rights and governance. If you look at, broadly speaking, spending in general, very little goes to that. And so I think there needs to be much more emphasis on that going forward. And these Machiavellian compromises that we make about, I mean, the US government, pretty much in private said that it knows the 2018 election was rigged, but it was the best possible outcome we could hope for. I don't think that is helping anybody going forward.
Danielle, over to you, please.
Well, yeah, I couldn't have said it better than Francesca and Jason, and they obviously know the country much better than I do. I guess just on that last point, I mean, as the elections come up next year in 2023, I think that's obviously a key point of focus for the international community and for domestic civil society. And I guess, my one kind of takeaway there is obviously we need to focus on investing in, these mechanisms of accountability, the Electoral Commission, making sure the voters register, is clean, the basic functioning of holding elections, allowing in election observers. But I think the importance of having a kind of 360-degree perspective on these, these broader dynamics that Jason's highlighted and that we have seen kind of reappear in different elections. So, one is the role of foreign lobbyists in the DRC, which have actually been quite active, and some of the opposition parties have been lobbying U.S. Politicians for their, for their visibility with the government. I think, the role of Uganda currently in the DRC as it's, trying to root out the allied, I think, defense forces, the ADF. Is going to play probably a role in that. And I think the diaspora community, we saw they played a really important role in different ways around the 2018 elections, both the diaspora in Europe and in South Africa. There's a large Congolese diaspora, so the different ways of information and disinformation that we saw around those elections from the diaspora, I think, require a lot of attention from the international community as well. So my kind of takeaway with this kind of 360-degree perspective, not just focusing on the usual infrastructure of elections, but these broader array of internal and external forces that could influence the outcome and Tshisekedi's response.
Thank you all for very important and succinct comments. So I think now I can actually do two final rounds. And let me begin with a couple of questions that are influenced and informed partly by the audience and partly by my own take. And starting with one for Jason on Rwanda and its role. And you talk about the evolution of Rwanda's role. So here we are in 2022. What needs to change today in US policy towards Rwanda, if anything, that could make a meaningful difference? And then for all of you together, but again, springing from Jason's book, but also Francesca and Danielle points you've made, does the international donor and business community need to develop a more common set of demands on the Tshisekedi government as a condition for engagement, for access to free trade and investment accords, to foreign assistance? In other words, you've talked about how the Tshisekedi government has in many ways perpetuated the same cronyism and corruption of its predecessor. How do we try to make a difference on that front? We, the outside world, the donor community, et cetera. So Rwanda specifically, but then more generally, the donor and business community. If I could put those two questions on the table, starting with Jason, please.
Well, I mean, the Rwandan government doesn't nearly play as important a role as it used to. I mean, it really was the key actor in destabilizing the Eastern Congo between 2004, broadly speaking, and 2013, when its most important military ally in the Eastern Congo, the M23, was defeated. It's remained involved. Most of its operations in the Eastern Congo are now done with the tacit agreement of the Congolese government, and it carries out many of those operations. What I would say that the key risk at the moment in the Eastern Congo is, again, misdiagnosing what neighboring countries actually are really up to in the Eastern Congo. At the moment, the Ugandan government has deployed a large force in joint operations with the Congolese government against the ADF, this Islamist Ugandan armed group in the Eastern Congo. I think the important thing to understand is that the overriding interest, as I see it, of the Ugandan government is actually not security and stability in the Eastern Congo, and is actually not even the ADF when it comes to these operations. Instead, President Museveni is in a position where he is trying to bolster his own support within the country, and possibly also orchestrate, after being in power for some 36 years now, a handover to somebody else, possibly his son. And so once again, operations in the Eastern Congo are important in order to providing patronage to his own officers, focusing on an external enemy, and probably also relate to economic opportunities, including oil and gold, which are extremely important for the Ugandan economy. The Rwandan government is also extremely worried about these Ugandan operations. Uganda and Rwanda have been in a competitive relationship at least since the 1999 clashes in the city of Kisangani in the Eastern Congo. And so Rwanda sees everything in the Eastern Congo through this lens of competition with its Ugandan, quote unquote, big brother. And so I think it's important going forward to understanding that those are probably the most important interests at stake for those neighboring countries, and not the security and stability of the Eastern Congo. I'll stop there, and I have a couple of thoughts about your second question as well.
Why don't you go ahead with the second question, please, right now, because then I'm not sure the others are going to comment on Rwanda as much as you were just able to, but they can certainly feel free to as they wish. But go ahead while you've got the floor, please.
So the second question regarding stability, I guess, and was it, Mike, if you just repeat, was it a... Yeah.
It's the way donors should potentially coordinate better and not be played off against each other and not perpetuate inadvertently or half intentionally the system of corruption that you've all been criticizing.
Well, I think that Tshisekedi actually, I mean, we have to be fair to Tshisekedi. He came in and there's certain things he has tried to change. I think the problem is it's a very scattershot approach. There's very little follow through. The East is, I think, a good example of that. Some things have changed. So he is, for example, the big thing that has changed for average Congolese is free primary education. This is a real thing. And now millions of students in the Congo have access to free primary education they did not have before. It is not very good quality primary education in many cases. It's led to strikes amongst the teachers who are no longer getting paid for a variety of reasons. It's complicated, but the bottom line is that there's some things that are changing. Francesca mentioned the fight against corruption. There's one government agency that has been extremely, has a crusade against corruption, and these things need to be strengthened, absolutely. But there is also a tendency that sort of underlines the systemic nature of the problem that I highlighted in my book, to continue to use the government as a means not of guaranteeing the interests of the population, but of distributing favors and patronage. And I think the donor class needs to be extremely vigilant. At the moment, the World Bank in particular and the IMF have become extremely prominent as donors to this new government. They see in Tshisekedi great hope, and that's fantastic. But they also need to be very clear that they don't become complicit in this problem of bad governance. The last thing I would say, and again, getting back to this notion of international political economy, there's no way for the Congo out of this mess and this morass without solving the fundamental paradox in the Congo, which is an extremely rich country and it's an extremely poor country. The Congo should be at the heart of the international economy. It produces more cobalt than any other country in the world, and that is key for renewable batteries that we need in everything, including in cars. It produces more copper than any country in Africa, and yet it is extremely poor. And the reason for that is, well, there's many reasons for that, but one of the reasons is that the international system, the international financial system, has become complicit in the fact that this is just extraction happening. There's almost no value that stays, there's no profit added in the Congo. There's very few jobs created by the mining industry. And that's something that many countries are complicit in. There's a lot of corruption, there's a lot of transfer pricing, there's a lot of bad mining deals struck. And I think that donors really need to pay attention, much more attention to that. That's going to be key to the long-term solution.
Thank you very much. If I could go to Francesca and then Danielle, please, on these same questions about, again, what Jason's been addressing. Rwanda, if you wish, but especially the donor community and how it works with the government, tries to change the incentives and improve the performance of the government. Francesca, over to you, please.
Okay. Am I on? Hello? Vous m'entendez? Okay, perfect. Okay. So, but I do agree totally with what Jason has said, totally. I mean, it's regarding the international community, from the Paris declarations, they have to align with the government priorities, and which is something that strive to do. But since I think since the last election, actually, I think since 2015, the government doesn't have a program that was validated at all levels of the government, provincial, central. So we don't have a program anymore. And why 2015 was the last one? Because that was the last one that was required by the international community. Since it's not required, we have something that's close to that, but so it's difficult for them to align with our priorities. When we do, they actually do align pretty well with the priorities that is set by the government. But the point is not that. The point is that they are not accountable, though, to the Congolese government. They are accountable to their own governments. So they all come in basically with the same policies and they pick and choose which provinces they have to work with, creating de facto some pocket of poverty that can, for instance, for example, Kasai, the conflict that arose in Kasai, you know, if you look at it, it was also one of the provinces that was totally neglected by the international community. So we need to be very careful about that. But regardless of that, I really think that the problem is not the international community, it's more so that the profile of DRC politician. I think what we should be doing is what South Africa has done at the end of apartheid. You know, every minister coming into office, they actually had a book where they were explaining, they call it the blank book, you know, what is your role, what are you supposed to do, what are the limits, what is the law. One of the great things that could improve governances is, for instance, to have a system of insurances. Every minister, when he comes into office, and then when he leaves with everything, the car, the computer, and everything else. There is even let's look at which is La Commission Nationale Électorale. You know, we don't have difficulty tracing all the electronic vote machines. And insurance, like they did in South Africa, is something that can be done. It's not the role of the international community or the government to do so. But having this blank book of explaining what is the Minister of Education is supposed to be, what is the role of the administrations, what is the law, what the law says about your own competencies, so to speak, I think is something that really helps South Africa after the apartheid, when they have this new minister coming in, and then I have no idea what their function was. And it's something that wasn't done in country like DRC that could, I think, be extremely useful for day-to-day governance.
Thank you very much. And then Danielle, and then we'll have a lightning round to wrap up.
Okay, well, yeah, I mean, I of course agree with the other panelists. I think, you know, what donors can do is, you know, some of the other interventions that my other panelists talked about, particularly investing in parliamentary oversight of loans and grants, you know, making that a condition of some of their assistance so that you're kind of indirectly strengthening the oversight body. Investing in audit agencies, in particular in parliamentary budget offices. And I think, as you know, Francesca's, I think, alluding to this mechanism of performance contracts within, you know, ministries and agencies where, you know, there's accountability upwards, you have a set of deliverables and targets, and you have to meet those, and there's some accountability and there's some kind of public transparency about what those are. And I mean, one of the best performers of performance contracts in Africa is Rwanda. So there could be some opportunity from a positive experience from the neighbor to the east, and how they have used that approach to get better performance. On a broader scale, though, I don't know if you can get donor coalescence, because it's an issue for Africa. I mean, it's a very diverse donor landscape now. You don't just have a body of traditional, you know, Western donors. Of course, the DRC, like much of Africa, is getting support from a variety of global actors, as we know, some of which are not concerned about good governance. And they're getting a lot of money from, you know, Eurobonds and sovereign wealth finance with private sector creditors as well. So I think there's opportunities for parts of the donor community to have an influence, but I think we need to be a little bit realistic about how much influence they can have, given that the donor landscape has shifted in the region more broadly. Lastly, I would just say there could be even greater integration within development agencies. You know, USAID, for instance, will give a lot of money for food security and agriculture, you know, without much attention to what its democracy and governance colleagues are doing. So this kind of greater integration of the development and democracy assistance communities, even within the same donor organizations, you know, would be very fruitful in DRC and more broadly.
Fantastic. So there are just a couple of questions outstanding and just a couple of minutes where we can maybe wrap up with your thoughts, and as well as any final brief concluding statement any of you would like to make. But one of them has to do with whether energy is an area where investment is important in Congo, and could that be transformational or not? The second question has to do with the EAC, the East Africa Community, and Congo's relationship to that, and whether that could be an opportunity for maybe more transparent and legal trade, and help deal with some of the issues of multiple actors extorting or acting in corrupt ways with the current economy as it exists, often with many of the resources in Eastern Congo. And then finally, there was a question just asking for a shout out for any of the one or two or three groups that you'd most want to celebrate. Now, Danielle's talked about the Catholic Church, and others of you have talked about some of the NGOs. And Francesca, you of course come from the Bureau d'études pour les recherches et consulting internationale. So you represent one such group, but I wondered if anybody wanted to just remind us of all the great things the Congolese people are already trying to do in the NGO and other sectors. And one of the questions from the audience asked for that. So that could be a nice inspirational way to finish as well. So if I could, Jason, we'll start with you and then just have a brief comment from each.
It's a lot of stuff to put on the table. Very briefly, rapid shot. I think the energy plays an important role. Congolese have a huge energy deficit. It's a huge problem. I don't think that the big, massive project, so Grandinga Dam is the utopian project for the African continent. It could be the largest hydroelectric project in the world at some point, if ever realized. I think that the way that's currently displayed or planned will not alleviate poverty in the Congo. Is mostly going to be for neighboring countries and for elites. I think you need to have rethink the way that energy is provided to make it pro-poor, much more investment in agriculture, much more investment in micro, in solar and things like that at the local level, microgrids. That I think would be much more transformational. It's a little bit outside of my expertise, but I definitely, from my experience, that's sort of the emphasis. But I do think that, there is a tendency, especially within the US and the UK government, to think that private enterprise will drive transformation. And while I don't necessarily disagree, I think what you need to have is make sure that any transformation also includes and puts an emphasis on the state. And that brings me to my final point, which is you asked me what kind of groups you can give a shout out to. There are inspirational groups, especially youth organizations such as Lucha in particular, that have understood that the challenge is a challenge of transforming the nature of the state, transforming the nature of the state in the Congo. They're out there in the streets all the time. They're protesting over potholes, over electricity, over governance, over all kinds of stuff. And they're trying to transform la politique from a bad word into a boon for the Congolese people. And finally, news organizations such as Actualité.cd, which is probably now the biggest and most important Congolese news organizations, all online. Good fact-driven news has been really transformational for Congolese conversations about this as well.
Jason, thank you very much. Francesca, over to you, please. You're still on mute, my friend. There you go.
In 2005 and in 2010, we did a huge survey for the World Bank, to help them set up their priorities in DRCs. And one of the priorities that the populations, we asked them what should be your priority if you want to join our community and do something, was the number one was electricity, and the number two was water. And basically they said that for education, we actually go by when we organize ourselves, to bypass the government. We did the same thing for health. But for those two things, energy and water supplies, we will need the help of the government. So I really think those issues, are one of the main keys, for DRC development if we're able to manage that. I do agree also that the direction that the state is taking right now with the INGA may not be the good one, but still, I really think that if one day we're going to speak about a country that's going to be less, what poverty is going to actually be reduced, those two things, energy and water and education, I think are the keys. Regarding, I do agree, news organizations are wonderful and the youth organizations are wonderful, but we also see a lot of very active women organizations who are, pushing some issues about at the governance level and which also, and I also say, violence against women, and also Dr. Mukwege, what he does at the DRC level, and also what he does at the continent. This issue is something really that we need to talk about more often than we do, and celebrate.
In passing and handing the baton to Danielle, I'll also thank my friend Tony Gambino, who works with one of these great organizations, and another inspiration to me, Professor Kabaita, who's helped me stay on DRC issues over my career. So Danielle, over to you for the last words.
Yeah, I'll just touch on the second question you had about the EAC. Here I'm not super optimistic. I think DRC is one of the few that has an overlapping now membership with SADC and EAC. I think we've seen in Africa more recently a kind of retreat to bilateralism, despite having these regional organizations. Even Kenya is more interested in its free trade area agreement with the US than enhancing its trade linkages in the EAC. And it's unfortunately been one of the kind of weaker organizations in terms of fostering trade in the region. So while certainly I think the rhetoric and the intentions of greater integration with the EAC is good in theory, I think the fact that we've seen a lot of pushback to regional organizations over the last year, and I think DRC hasn't even ratified the African Continental Free Trade Agreement yet, suggests that it would be much more complicated to have tackle some of these big picture issues that Jason has shown in his book than just joining this organization. Even Rwanda and Uganda have been very hostile to each other and closed their border at one point, and despite they've both been longstanding members of the EAC. So that's just my pessimistic takeaway on that point.
Well, pessimistic takeaway on that point, but still some pretty encouraging words from all of you in the sense that you've helped identify problems in DRC and some paths going forward where progress perhaps can be made. I want to again thank Jason Stearns for this outstanding book that I recommend highly, The War That Doesn't Say Its Name, that provided the inspiration and catalyst for our conversation today. I want to thank friends from all over the world, especially in Congo, for joining us, and wish everyone a very happy and successful March and beyond in this year 2022. So thanks for joining us today, and farewell from all of us at Brookings and around the world.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.